The efforts by the US and its allies to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions have hit a make-or-break point this month, with US President Donald Trump threatening to strike Iran if negotiations don't move forward. Trump is pushing for a restart of nuclear talks that were sidelined when Israel launched its bombing campaign against Iran last week. But tensions between the US and Iran have been simmering on for decades. Points of contention have included control over Iran's oil reserves, US political interference in Tehran, Iran's desire for nuclear power, and both countries' growing influence in the Middle East. It's a long and complicated history. But let's start in 1951, when tensions between Iranians and foreign powers influencing the country first start to bubble. 1951. Tension over British influence in Iran. Since the early 1900s, the British government has retained control over Iran's oil reserves through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. By the time Mohammad Mossadegh is appointed prime minister, Iranians are tired of foreign involvement in their affairs, and calls for Iranians to regain control of their natural resources are growing louder. 1953. CIA overthrows Iran's democracy. The US helps stage a coup to overthrow Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mossadegh. He had moved to nationalize the country's oil fields, a move the US and Great Britain saw as a serious blow, given their dependence on oil from the Middle East. After toppling Mossadegh, the US supports Iran's monarch Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to rule as Shah of Iran. Iranians resent the foreign interference, fueling anti-American sentiment in the country for decades to come. 1957. Nuclear cooperation. The US signs a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with Iran. The agreement provides Iran with technology and resources that eventually become the foundation for its controversial nuclear program, which it begins developing in the 1970s with support from the US. 1979. The Iranian Revolution. Millions of Iranians take to the streets in protest of the Shah's regime, which they view as corrupt and illegitimate. Secular protesters oppose his authoritarianism, while Islamist protesters oppose his modernization agenda. On January 16, the Shah flees the country. On February 1, Ayatollah Khomeini, an Islamic scholar who had been arrested and deported by the Shah in 1964, returns from exile and becomes the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. 1979 to 1981. Iran hostage crisis. Iranian students storm the US embassy in Tehran and take dozens of Americans hostage. They demand the Shah, who had been admitted into the US for cancer treatment, be extradited to Iran to stand trial for crimes against the Iranian people. After 444 days, Iran releases the hostages in exchange for state assets being unfrozen, minutes after President Ronald Reagan is sworn into office. During the crisis, the US cuts all diplomatic ties with Iran. Formal diplomatic relations have never been restored. The Shah dies in July 1980 in Cairo. 1980. Iran-Iraq War begins. The bad blood between the two countries is only made worse when the US backs Iraq in its invasion of neighboring Iran, prompting an 8-year regional war. Qasem Soleimani, who has joined the elite Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps by this time, fights on the front lines of this war. 1984. US declares Iran a sponsor of terrorism. Under Reagan's administration, the US declares the Islamic Republic a state sponsor of terrorism. Decades later, this designation by the US still stands. 1986. Iran-Contra affair. While the US is backing Iraq in its war with Iran, President Reagan's administration covertly begins looking into ways to improve its relationship with Iran. The press reveals that despite an embargo on selling weapons to Iran, Reagan approved a high-profit sale in hopes that it will yield the return of Americans held hostage in Lebanon by Hezbollah, a militia with close ties to Iran. 1988. US shoots down an Iranian plane, while American and Iranian ships are exchanging fire in the Persian Gulf. The US mistakes a civilian airliner for a fighter jet and shoots down Iran Air Flight 655. All 290 passengers and crew members on board are killed. Though the US says the attack is an accident, Iranians see it as intentional. 1997. Soleimani appointed head of the Quds Force. Qasem Soleimani, who has been rising through the ranks of the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, is appointed chief commander of the Quds Force, an elite special forces unit that handles Iran's overseas operations. He is instrumental in spreading Iran's influence in the Middle East, and soon becomes one of the country's most powerful leaders. 2002. George Bush declares Iran part of an axis of evil. After the 9/11 attacks, Iran quietly helps the US in its war against the Taliban, a mutual enemy of both countries. But in a State of the Union address, President George Bush refers to Iran, along with Iraq and North Korea, as part of an axis of evil. The speech incites anger in Iran. 2003. Iran nuclear threat. As the US voices concerns that Iran is attempting to develop nuclear weapons, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency announce they've found traces of highly enriched uranium at a nuclear plant in Iran. Tehran agrees to suspend production of enriched uranium and allow stricter inspections of its nuclear sites. But this is short-lived. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad would come into power a few years later and restart Iran's production of enriched uranium, prompting years of international sanctions against the country. 2013. Iran nuclear deal is signed. After years of negotiations with President Barack Obama's administration, 6 nations and Tehran reach a landmark agreement that slows Iran's nuclear development program in exchange for lifting some sanctions that caused the country's economy to stagnate. It's a huge breakthrough for the US and Iran, which have long been at odds. 2017. Trump takes office. A week after his inauguration, President Donald Trump signs an executive order banning nationals from 7 Muslim-majority nations, including Iran, from entering the US for 90 days. Iran calls the ban an obvious insult to the Islamic world, and responds by conducting a ballistic missile test. The back and forth marks a sudden escalation in tensions between the two countries, raising concerns about the future of the Iran nuclear deal. 2018. Trump quits the Iran nuclear deal. Trump fulfills a campaign promise and announces he is withdrawing the US from the Iran nuclear deal, which he viewed as one-sided. He also says he will place new sanctions on the regime. Critics warn the move could lead Iran to restart its atomic program and set the stage for more conflict in the Middle East. 2019. April. US labels IRGC a terrorist organization. President Trump announces that the US will formally designate the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, Tehran's most powerful military institution, as a foreign terrorist organization. The move is unprecedented, marking the first time that the US designated a part of another government as a terror group. Iran responds by declaring the USA state sponsor of terrorism. June. Iran blamed for attacks in the Gulf. Tensions further escalate after attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf and oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, as well as the downing of a US drone, which Washington and its allies blame on Iran. American officials repeatedly stress that threats to the freedom of navigation in the Gulf and the oil trade are unacceptable. But the Trump administration takes no action. Iran reduces commitments to nuclear deal. After the US imposes several rounds of sanctions on Iran that were originally lifted under the Iran nuclear deal, Iran announces it will ramp up enrichment of low-grade uranium. This breaks the stockpile limit it agreed to in 2015, and brings the country one step closer to being able to build a nuclear bomb. December. US strikes facilities in Iraq and Syria. US forces conduct airstrikes on facilities in Iraq and Syria, which the Pentagon claims are linked to pro-Iranian militias responsible for attacking US service personnel in Iraq. At least 25 people are killed, an Iran-backed militia says. Days later, hundreds of pro-Iranian demonstrators attempt to storm the US embassy in Baghdad, scaling the walls and forcing the gates open, in protest of the US airstrikes. 2020. US kills Soleimani, and Iran responds. Trump says he ordered an airstrike in Iraq to kill Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, a move that previous US presidents had considered far too provocative. Thousands of people flood the streets of Iran to mourn him. Iran is furious and vows retaliation, ultimately firing missiles at Iraqi bases that house American troops a few days later. No lives are lost, and Trump responds by promising more sanctions. As tension is running high, Iran mistakenly shoots down a Ukrainian passenger jet, attributing it to a fear of US aggression. All 176 people on board are killed. April. Tensions rise at sea. Tensions rise again when the U.S. accuses Iranian naval vessels of harassing American warships in the northern Arabian Sea. Later that month, Iran conducts its first successful satellite launch, utilizing the same technology that is used in intercontinental ballistic missiles. 2021. April. Talks revived under Biden. U.S. President Joe Biden attempts to revive the nuclear deal. Iran and the U.S. hold indirect talks in Vienna. The talks continue despite an apparent explosion at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. Iran blames the explosion on Israel and announces it will ramp up uranium enrichment to 60% purity. Biden says this decision is not helpful. October. Iran's new president. The nuclear talks stall after the ultra-conservative judiciary chief Ibrahim Raisi becomes Iran's new president. Raisi appoints a new, hard-line negotiating team. The US, UK, France and Germany issue a joint statement saying they're convinced that it is possible to quickly reach and implement an understanding on return to full compliance of the Iran nuclear deal. Raisi died in a helicopter crash in 2024. 2022. February. Russia invades Ukraine. The nuclear talks are put on hold after Russia launches its full-scale unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. As the war drags on, Iran begins helping Russia, providing Moscow with weapons, including Shahed drones. End of 2022 to 2023. Talks stall amid mass protests. Months of mass protests against the Iranian regime end in a brutal crackdown. The Biden administration's support for the protesters contributes to the stalling of the nuclear talks. After months of frustration, the Biden administration publicly says the nuclear deal is not on the agenda. Indirect talks resume quietly towards the end of the year with Oman serving as intermediary. 2023. September. U.S. and Iran agree prisoner swap. 5 Americans are freed from Iranian detention as part of a wider deal that includes the U.S. unfreezing $6 billion in Iranian funds held in South Korea and the release of 5 Iranians from U.S. custody. After the release, the U.S. imposes sanctions on Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad over the lack of information about another American, Bob Levinson, who is believed to have died while detained in Iran. October 7. Hamas attacks Israel. Hamas and its allies launch a terror attack against southern Israel, killing more than 1,200 people and taking 251 hostages. The U.S. assesses that while Iran has provided material support to Hamas for decades. 2024. April 14. Iran attacks Israel with drones and missiles. Iran launches a direct attack on Israel for the first time, firing hundreds of missiles and drones in retaliation for what it said was an Israeli attack on its embassy in Damascus. Syria. The U.S. and other allies help Israel defend itself against the barrage, shooting down most of the missiles. This comes after the U.S. conducts a series of airstrikes against Iran-backed militias in Syria and Iraq in October and November 2023, as well as February 2024, in retaliation for their attacks on U.S. troops in the Middle East. July. Iran plots to assassinate Trump. U.S. authorities obtain intelligence from a human source on a plot by Iran to try to assassinate Donald Trump. Sources tell CNN, the U.S. government had repeatedly warned that Iran may try to retaliate for the 2020 U.S. drone strike that killed General Qasem Soleimani, by trying to kill Trump. Who ordered the strike, or his former advisors? October 1. Iran launches missile attack on Israel. Iran launches another direct missile attack on Israel after Israel attacks Iran. The U.S. again assists Israel in shooting down most of the missiles. 2025. March. Trump's letter to Khamenei. Trump returns to office in January, reinstating his campaign of maximum pressure on Iran. In March, he sends a letter to Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei proposing negotiations on a new nuclear deal. He gives a 2-month deadline to reach an agreement. April. Indirect talks resume. The U.S. and Iran hold largely indirect talks in Oman, the first between the Trump administration and Tehran. A second round of high-level talks between U.S. and Iranian delegations takes place in Rome, with Oman again acting as a mediator. Both sides express optimism after the summit. 3 more rounds follow. But Iran's insistence that it has the right to enrich uranium remains a major sticking point. May 28. Trump optimistic about a deal. Trump says he believes his administration is very close to a solution on an Iran nuclear agreement. He says he personally warned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to disrupt the talks. The next round of talks between Iran and the US is scheduled for mid-June. June 13. Israel attacks Iran. Israel launches a major attack against Iran. The US initially distances itself from the attack. But Trump quickly begins voicing his support for Israel and floats the idea of American intervention, although he opposes the killing of Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. According to sources,